You're listening to Make Planning Make Sense. I'm Aaron and I'm a director at Centro.
And I'm Alex, a planner at Centro.
Today we're speaking with Alex Uregian, a director at City Sanctuary.
City Sanctuary is a housing developer focused on health and well-being.
And an SME. So this dovetails really nicely with the conversation that we had with Paul Higgs in the previous episode, and it touches on some of those core themes, but from a meaningfully different perspective, which was really nice.
Alex Uregian is director at City Sanctuary, an SME housing developer with a focus on well-being and health.
SME developers with big picture energy. Our socials are Instagram, X, Blue Sky, and YouTube. Our handle on all platforms is MPMS Podcast. Please give us a follow, give us a shout. We want this to be a two-way conversation always with our guests and with our audience. So drop us a line, let us know what you're wondering or what you think. Here is our conversation with Alex Uregian. Alex Uregian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much, guys.
Alex, tell us a little bit about City Sanctuary and how it came to be.
Yeah, so I am a second generation developer out of Greece originally. I studied civil and environmental engineering here in the UK. I worked as a structural engineer and I did some sustainability advising for government for the then zero carbon homes agenda back in, that was 2010, what are more commonplace now like air source heat pumps and the like. When you talk to folks about sustainability, I think other than the few who are sort of evangelists, it wasn't really tangible, I felt. You know, what's 1.5 degrees centigrade? What is X tons of carbon per meter squared per year? But when we started talking about what the benefits of, let's say, these MVHR units are, like it purifies the air, so you get sick less often, you can perform better at work, you can play with your kids and not get as tired. The minute you start to make sustainability about the person, about the soul, I felt at least during those interviews really started to resonate a lot more. And that was really the genesis of City Sanctuary. And we are, as Alex said, a health first, people first property developer, SME developer in sort of the London and up to, let's say, zones 5 or 6.
Super keen to understand that a bit more. Yeah, especially in the context of being an SME developer, right? Our built environment and our environment generally is the largest category of indicators for what will constitute a good life. You know, are you safe? Are you dry? Are you able to sleep well? Is your air clean?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. And, you know, we spend 90% of our time indoors. You know, much of that is at home, maybe increasingly so. My wife actually happens to be a professor of child development. So I happen to have insight into a lot of this research. And what we're looking to do is take that science and map it into the built environment. And, you know, as I said, that takes lots of different forms. We have a 100-point plan where it's, have we done this, have we done that, have we done the other? And we can't do everything. But overall, if we achieve a certain score, then we feel like we've done our best for a particular development and for the particular residents within that development.
From a planning perspective, it's almost like you're playing the role of the officer on yourself and then, I suppose, trying to go get permission to build it?
Yeah, look, I think it does resonate with some authorities more than others. But, you know, we don't do it for that. We do it for us. We do it for the residents. And, you know, hopefully if the market sort of recognizes that as well, and we can come onto that a little bit later, then I think we're doing a good job.
Yeah.
You mentioned this shift in your career from working on sustainability in a policymaking capacity to working on it in a developer capacity and in a delivery capacity. What was your motivation for doing that?
Well, as I mentioned at the top, I am a second generation developer. It's kind of in my bones. I tell the story of, for all intents and purposes, growing up on the building site, right? So did I ever have a choice, Alex, is the question. Was there really an alternative? But jokes aside, anecdotes aside, I have an inherent interest. I don't necessarily want to call it a passion because that's a kind of a loaded word, but I have a deep interest and a spark, shall we say, of excitement when I talk about sort of things that are larger than just a single building. Anything in the intersection of psychology, of sociology, of history, and the built environment, I eat all that stuff up. So policy was maybe feeding one of, or scratching one of those itches that I have.
And that was my first impression of you when we first met. that we just clicked. And it speaks to a recurring theme that we've been discussing on the podcast and that we haven't really ever set out to discuss specifically. There is so much deep interest or whatever on the private side. There's so much good intent. And unless and until the case officer knows us, there's a really important need to build that connection with them as well, because it's not really a given that we might also be really interested in these things.
Yeah.
I think that it's really admirable that you assess the quality of life indicators independently. We just need to standardize your methodology and be like, that's it, guys, we're done.
Yeah, as it happens, we didn't develop our own metrics and standard for any other reason other than one didn't exist, which in itself was depressing.
Testify.
So although one did exist or a couple exist in the sort of commercial space, in the office space, for single sort of family residential, none exists. So we created our own, build it and they'll come. But in the intervening period, there have been one or two pilot standards that have been introduced. And one of them is the IWBI's, the WELL standard. And we're actually working with them on a pilot scheme to test their standard against our standard and contribute to the learning.
Keep me posted, basically.
Okay.
If it's a model that is built on the kind of development that, say, an SME developer is doing, is there sort of a selection on the dependent variable problem where, if you did apply it to a tower in Stratford or Croydon or whatever, it would say all of that's unacceptable on the lower levels, for example?
Yeah, with the WELL standard in particular, there's sufficient flexibility to achieve the standard without tick boxing every single box, right? So they envisage that. For example, the pilot study that we've done with them is a retrofit in a listed building. So we went for what we felt, at least, was the most constrained environment that we could create. And we managed to make it work. Maybe there was a 10% cost premium over the standard retrofit cost that we have. And frankly, we exceeded the minimum point threshold by 50%. So if you were to just try and scrape the minimum points, then you could do it for a 5 to 6%. Every penny counts, especially when we're discussing viability. And I imagine we'll be discussing that in detail shortly. But that's one side of the ledger, the cost side.
Yep.
The benefit side is the other side of the ledger. And our thesis following this study is that health pays.
You mentioned the residential market.
I did.
You're an SME.
I am.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, look, it's not pretty, Aaron.
No.
But I would, encourage you to look at the 40-year horizon where you'll see that as an SME subsector, we've been in decline from the late 80s, right? We used to build 40% of new builds in the late 80s, right? We now build, 9, 10? We were, as a body, 12,500 strong in the late 80s. We're now barely 2.5. It's a subsector in decline and getting harder. Trending downwards is what I say. Now, look, not looking necessarily for special treatment. Your local grocer is threatened by the big supermarkets. Your local cafe, your local coffee shop is threatened by the big multinational coffee chains. It's not unique to property, but I think the impact is not just on SMEs, but the impact to society is outsized compared to those subsectors.
There are all sorts of ways as well that you're not competing directly with Barclay because they're not doing a 9-unit scheme. There's space in the market that British Land is never going to pick up. We spoke with Paul Higgs recently. And
The Paul Higgs.
The Paul Higgs. Sorry, I sat back while Paul Higgs spoke and it was beautiful. But his point was right from the beginning, and there's all sorts of market forces that are constraining SME developers. The very gate, the very point of entry into a development for a given site, which is planning, has become so much more demanding. And the risk as a proportion of probability is increased.
No doubt.
Is it planning's fault? If you say yes, it works for the narrative of the podcast, but you can say no as well.
Yes.
It's multifactorial.
And no.
Oh.
Yeah. So, look, it's absolutely an ecosystem problem where I would say without hesitation that the SME industry is in peril. I would say we're probably facing an existential threat. And, that's a confluence of different waves all happening concurrently. So there's the structural decline that I mentioned from, the late 80s. And the requirements for planning play a part to that. I agree with a lot of them for a lot of the big sites. I think there's a proportionality problem, but we can come back to that later. But there's also a cyclical issue, which is the shocks that we've experienced in the last few years as they relate to building costs, inflation, 40 to 50% up for us anyway. Finance costs doubled, literally doubled. And, these are big factors, big numbers that absolutely changed the game to the extent where a lot of the sites that, and I'm not afraid to admit it, a lot of the sites that we look at have what's called a negative land value. That literally means for us to make industry accepted standard profit between 15 and 20%, which, by the way, our lenders require to greenlight the projects, the landowner needs to pay us for us to buy their land or their building. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? That means that, or how has that played out? Not just amongst SMEs, but also amongst larger developers. London has a housing target, and that's 88,000 per year. We're currently at, if you were to annualize it, at 9%. 9% of that 88,000 number.
Mm-hmm. And also failure. Not at 100 for kind of ever. So not only are we talking about this in terms of the economics for SMEs, for the entire industry, there's also the crisis of the lack of outcome, the lack of product being delivered. Mm-hmm. And it's not really ever been okay since like the 1960s.
Yeah.
I have to assume that it's something about our national context, and maybe it is a confluence of factors, but the ratio of dwellings to population has increased more quickly in Germany, France, and Japan than in the UK, right? In fact, the number of dwellings per person in London has shrunk by 0.7%.
Yeah.
And that was just figure one. It's a really good report. Figure two goes on to say that, by the way, the units themselves, the homes themselves are larger in France and Germany. I think only marginally larger in Japan, but there are also more of them. So you still end up with more floor space per person.
Yeah. And we've known that for a long time. I mean, there was the Barker Review of Housing Supply in 2003, which basically also said housing in the UK is becoming more expensive more quickly than the European average.
And then in 2006, she said it so nice, she said it twice. And
it might be the planning system.
Yes. So just to sort of TLDR summarize that report. So you're absolutely right. There were two key findings as far as I was concerned, or two key findings that struck me in any event. Number one is overall, if we had the same number of dwellings per person, so if we matched the number of dwellings per person in France and Germany, our European friends and partners, we would have 6.5 million additional homes. So that was one striking mic drop. The second one was that even since 1993, if we had met their growth in homes per person, we would have had 4 million additional homes. So it's not just that we're short, it's that we're falling shorter as time goes by as well, right?
Yeah, it's getting worse.
Yeah.
When I talk about housing land supply, and an increasingly frequent part of my job is reminding LPAs that they don't have a 5-year housing land supply, or that they're not meeting their delivery targets.
Oh, they must love hearing that, don't they?
They do not.
They do not. Okay, very good.
Which makes this next part even harder, but it's the ever worsening housing crisis.
Yeah.
It's every year it gets worse.
Yeah. And, again, I just want to emphasize that this is an ecosystem, right? Planning is one element. We could optimize the planning system and we wouldn't necessarily have solved affordability. And I think that's where I maybe get frustrated with some of my developer colleagues who conflate, say, fix the planning system and everything will be affordable. It's just not true. We're in such a deficit, right, that solving planning won't solve affordability. And in fact, I would even go further, right?
Yeah.
In fact, affordability is an issue in Europe, in the US, in Canada, and they all have zoning.
To varying degrees. So the US is a really interesting market because planning is almost always zoning, yes, but it's also at the city level or the municipal level of whatever, borough, township.
Yeah.
and it results in insanely different outcomes in terms of build cost and volume. So if you haven't picked up a copy of Ezra Klein's Abundance yet, please do. Really good. It's audiobook as well.
He runs through one of his chapters from memory, right?
Yeah. So it does a little bit of a comparison between, I don't know if it's Houston or Dallas, as a more productive and less ambitiously controlled planning regime, and San Francisco. And it's staggeringly different how much a single unit costs and also what the rate of delivery is. And I agree that planning reform is not going to be the ticket to solving the housing crisis or the affordable housing crisis or the housing affordability crisis. It is absolutely multifactorial. But none of those three crises will be fixed unless planning is also fixed.
You know, I think if nothing else, it feels like something that we can fix, right? Market dynamics, it's a complex system. It's like the weather. You can't quite predict. You bring three economists to a room, you'll get four different opinions, right? Planning is not a complex system. It's a complicated system. And there's a distinction between the two. One is sort of more predictable and workable if you create the environment, curate the environment, design the environment for it to perform. If nothing else, it's worth tackling the planning question because it's something that we can solve.
The single largest determinative factor in the outcome of a process is the design of the process itself.
I subscribe to that.
When we talk about make planning make sense, trademark, we're talking about our perspective. And I think that mixing these perspectives, having people like you at the table, having people like the public sector at the table, we need to get a financier in here, basically. We need all of these perspectives. So everybody can say, here's what isn't working for my part of this process. And what we definitely need to avoid is the whataboutism, that when we say planning is broken and people say, but what about financing? It's like, well, yeah, also what about financing? But it's an and, not a but.
No, I agree with that. We find ourselves at a particular point in time where things are so far from working, it feels as though, where do you start? But I have always maintained that you start at the points that you can fix and not at the points that you can control and not the points that you can't.
We will be right back.
We're a people sort of first developer, and I just want to shout out to the individuals in, you know, some of these local authorities, like what they have to deal with the cuts and the pressures from, you know, different consultees, and like it's such a difficult job.
I can only imagine, not least of all because agents are badgering them because you know, we tried not to do it like, you know, in a way that pisses them off, but just the nature of it is something that I can understand must be overwhelming. But we have to do it because we're trying to produce answers and results for our clients, and it's a bit of a, you know, stuck in the middle thing. What that must feel like to be emailed and called frequently by all of these different agents, while also having the anxiety of a workload that you can't dig yourself out of. That's gotta suck.
Yeah, and you know, you can't decouple that from sort of some of the decisions or all the delays. It's a discretionary planning system, but not funded for the discretionary planning system to work effectively, ultimately. So it's like, you know, trying to, you know, playing basketball with one hand, for example. It's your hamstrung. You can't see that lasting for much longer. It's just not sustainable.
Yeah. You know, we think about the people and, well, if they could have just done that differently, if they could have just answered the phone, gotten back to us, told us where they wanted the DDA space, updated the drawings like I asked, whatever it is, how much of that is them in their intention and how much of that is them reacting to a planning system where they are not seeing the opportunity to do the thing that brought them into this profession.
Well, once you figure it out, let me know, because I would love to know as well.
I think it's money. That's my current hypothesis.
Well, it might be. There's also a little bit of, I don't want to use this word lightly, but there's a phrase lightly, but risk aversion, right? These buildings will be here for a while, and you have, let's just call it a burden of responsibility and a long footprint that you need to maintain. And with that kind of stewardship mindset, I would certainly want the best, because it's going to be here for a long time and we'll be judged on this, and our generation will be judged on this. So you're not going to get necessarily a cohort that's looking to take risks, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of those concerns are justified, to be honest. Like you said,
100%.
a lot of those things, I mean, we need to be thorough in a lot of ways. And but the question is, where do we put that workload? Do we repeat that workload at every single development as we do in our discretionary system? Or do we front load it, which relates to some of the recommendations that the Centre for City report was making? Do we front load a lot of that work so it doesn't have to be repeated every single time?
Yeah, it's a great point. We're starting from scratch every single time.
Yeah.
This application and the application next door to it has to produce the same reports over and over and over again.
I want to draw on something you said earlier about SME developers being disproportionately impacted by the UK planning system. Is that something, the discretionary nature of the system, that you believe contributes to that? One of the recommendations made in the Centre for City report is, for example, for site allocations to be much, much more specific.
Yes, I think it would take out a lot of the certainty. And I think the funding landscape would also clarify as a result of that. Because there's a different set of funders who are available when there is planning or certainty with planning, and a different set of folks who operate in the market when there isn't planning and there's planning risk, right? And the difference in interest rates is stark between those two states of plays. And the proportionality that you mentioned absolutely impacts SMEs. We did some research with Searchland, which is a platform which kind of aggregates lots of different planning information and demographic information and sales information. And we did a little bit of research on planning performance and percentage success. Across Greater London, the average success of the schemes that had fewer than 10 units was 62%. Above, up to 50, the mid-range, was around 72%. And above 50 units, it had 86% approval, right? So that tells me empirically that there's a structural bias towards larger schemes. The system isn't working well for SMEs. Now, look, also maybe the small SME developers are less experienced. They employ, less experienced consultants.
Appropriately hedging your position.
Yeah,
what are some
exactly.
other sort of reasons do you think that might be?
So I think the flip side to what I just said about the less experienced developers is that you also have perhaps less experienced case officers on the case, who will perhaps tend to lean on sort of chapter and verse of planning policy when we know that a lot of these documents are in conflict, right? So a nuanced, balanced position is needed, and that comes with experience. And the smaller applications might have the younger case officers, the more inexperienced case officers who are learning and don't necessarily have the support that they need from their team leaders because the whole system's under-resourced. But I think the solution to the SME problem is not just in the individuals, but also in the process. I could easily imagine a sort of fast-track system for the smaller schemes where the requirements on the sometimes hundreds of reports that one needs to provide for what is a very, very sort of minor application, and that could very certainly be optimized.
As planning has gotten more complicated, as planning requirements have increased, we've seen a decline in SME developers. And is that simply because as a smaller developer, you just don't have the economies of scale to deal with the ever-increasing planning and evidence requirements?
Yeah, if we were to diagnose the patient, that would certainly be one of the findings.
The patient has so many co-occurrences.
It feels ominous, doesn't it?
Yeah,
so that's one of them. The time associated with planning consents is also a big factor. SMEs often have expensive financing, and every day literally costs money. So every day that the planning application is delayed eats away at the bottom line. Sidebar point, I mentioned sort of the headline percentage success, planning success of small sites, medium sites, large sites. The inverse is also true with the time required to achieve said consent. Now, if you were to reduce it to a days per dwelling, you will see in that same research that we did that it takes approximately, for the 50 plus, for the larger applications, 6 days per dwelling for an approval.
Yeah.
and it takes 31 days per dwelling for
Wow.
approval
Wow.
of the smaller schemes.
Wow.
Where SMEs are, where you would typically find SMEs. So
yeah.
time is a killer, I would say, and especially for SMEs that don't have the deep balance sheets to be able to sustain that. It's literally, it's not just the difference between a marginally profitable site and a very profitable site. It's the difference between being around next year and not, because we just don't have the deep pockets to be able to sustain us through the shocks.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, one interesting thing from what you just said, large sites seem to work, or at least they work better, right? Large allocated sites work better. And funny enough, and this is the last time I'll mention the Centre for Cities report, but in looking at...
Are you plugging them? And so you should, by the way. They do excellent work.
They do such good work, by the way.
One of the recommendations happens to be, or in looking at other planning systems in other contexts, they're looking at Germany, for example, they're looking at the Bebauungsplan system, which is essentially what we have here in the UK for site allocations. It's just, well, I mean, not quite at site allocations, or don't provide quite as much detail, but essentially, yeah, you're allocating a land and providing more certainty and specificity.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And therefore not having to demonstrate that those elements of whatever you're proposing are acceptable if that's what you're going to propose. I think that that's a key difference as well, because even on site allocations that do go into a lot of detail, they're still going to ask the applicant to prove to them that the air quality is going to be acceptable for residential use or whatever it is. You don't get to skip any of the reports with the allocation.
Yeah. And look, I've heard strong arguments for the current planning system because of its democratic nature. I think they're strong anyway, right? You've got councillors who represent the interests of the people, some people in any event, those who go out to vote for local elections. But there's a democratic argument for the current system. What I say to them is that you can also build in democracy at the earlier stage, right? You can build in a higher level sort of input, not what color should the bricks be, but, height, massing, green space, all sorts of things can be brought in at a master plan level, not just for a site, but for an area. And that's the point where you could bring in democratic input. Downstream, it's deemed to satisfy or can be checked that it does satisfy over those overarching principles.
That's exactly what we were discussing with
was
Ollie
gonna say.
Sargent
That's-
at Cartwright. That's also what then Secretary Gove was banging on about. It's a plan-led process. Get people involved in the plan making.
Yeah.
And I think that it democratizes it further than just asking everybody in a whatever media radius, because at least to some extent you're asking people in an authority, so you're capturing most likely a good bit of the community.
It's also politically expedient, though.
Oh my God, it'd make my life a lot easier. I'd get so many weeknight evenings back, but it also gives an opportunity to ask everyone, and you're more likely to get a sympathy and a recognition for the fact that the housing is needed rather than just focus on construction dust and parking.
You really need to bring in that, you need to kind of like extract it from local residents at the appropriate time. I think it could be a fantastic change whilst also addressing the democratic argument, which I think is valid as well. And it's one of my pet peeves with private developers being the almost near sole delivery mechanism of affordable housing as well. And even more so, the fact that SMEs are in decline, which means that the delivery of said affordable homes is almost certainly within the sort of the gift, shall we say, of the big seven developers and house builders. And that, for me, is a concentration risk for the country, right? You're in the...
Too big to fail.
Well, yes, too big to fail, but they're also private enterprises, and they should, it's their mandate to maximize profit, and it's their mandate to slow down development if they feel as though the sales market is slowing down and they can't sell their stock. They're not a charity.
It's not their mandate to deliver enough homes, is another way to put it. And I was talking about this as well with Paul. It's really not a healthy way to approach the housing delivery issue, with a frustration that a private company is acting like a private company.
Yeah. In fact, I would call it an abusive relationship insofar as...
Damn.
insofar as as a country, the government has decided that the main delivery vehicle for affordable homes is in the gift of companies that are not incentivized to deliver those homes. You couldn't have devised a more bonkers reverse incentive system, completely misaligned.
And at the moment, they're not even able to do it, even if they wanted.
Yeah.
The maths are just that bad.
Well, the maths is that bad, and the system is designed in such a way that it misaligns the incentives of who you depend on, and they need to slow down the delivery of homes because they can't sell them, and it's a conveyor belt, right? The whole development system is a conveyor belt. If you can't sell them on the back end, you'll slow the production down at the middle so that you can align the conveyor belt and it all moves smoothly. It's a business after all. In fact, it's from a business perspective, it's exactly the right thing. Why are we depending on, these businesses to build our affordable homes? Yeah. There are other ways.
Why would you keep building cars if the finished car lot isn't getting emptied and sold on, right?
Exactly. Unless you incentivize those private enterprises to build, or you take on the delivery yourself as a state.
Yeah.
And I think every single sort of way I look at this, it has to be one or the other. And it's unfortunate because I wish there were other more palatable ways of doing so.
Well, and by the way, if, the state, if you're listening, we'd love to be your planning agents.
Deep state.
The state. By the way, the state, if you are listening, we'd love to be your planning agents when you step forward as a house builder once again. And
if you want to,
it's not a radical conversation, to just sort of to fill out your point, because it doesn't need to be the state coming in and saying, I'm British housing or whatever, and now I'm going to do this. It could be grant funding S106 affordable units. It could be changing the terms of licensing an RP to make them acquire units in S106 developments and fund it to back it up, right? Make sure that the funding model works. But there's a lot of sitting on our hands, I think, at the moment.
You could also reinvigorate the SME development industry and partner with them to deliver more homes, diversify your delivery mechanisms beyond the big seven. And, we don't have huge pipelines as SMEs, so we want to get on it. We're less of a conveyor belt and more kind of like a manual assembly of cars. So we just want to do the 2 or 3 projects that we're on and then move on to the next ones, as opposed to looking at it as a complicated system.
Can we explore that a little bit for a second?
I guess to make it really concrete, if there's an example you can think of, and to just break it down, like what has uninvigorated SMEs in the first place? Like, is there a land-oriented solution that you can think of that the government could look at, or is there a demand-side kind of solution that the government could look at?
That was about my question, but through a different door, because I was going to ask, is this sort of like a procurement process, or is this a grant funding process? But you're looking at it also in terms of market mechanisms that could be adjusted. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. So look, I think that there have been a few suggestions, something called stewardship model, or indeed a JV model between SME developers and local government, local authorities. A stewardship model where the land isn't actually transacted, but you bring in the SME developer as a delivery partner.
Right.
And by not transacting on the land, then the initial capital outlay of the developer is lower, and the interest payments across the entire duration of the project is also lower, which makes things more viable, more likely to deliver more homes. So, those are just like 2 examples of where there's aligned incentives. You can build more trust, but the incentives need to be aligned. The developer needs to be on the hook on this stewardship model for more than just deliver the homes and then off you go, right? I think a really interesting model, which aligns incentives between developers and affordable housing provision, is the LIHTC model in the US. That's the low income housing tax credit model.
Yeah. I remember talking about this in the chat.
So I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
In fact, when I was working in New York as a structural engineer at the time, and we were designing, and I was actually on site as well, for a 4-city block regeneration project in Williamsburg. The entire shoulder of the development, so not the middle part, which was 40, 50 stories, try being in New York 40 stories up during construction in the winter. That was, I soon moved back to the UK.
Test your metal, I imagine, yeah.
But whilst I was up there, I was wondering, how is this entire shoulder, like, how is that all affordable? What are they doing? What's by choice as well, right? There's no mandate.
No slap fights.
Yeah, so I was like, what's going on here? Why are they doing this? Especially in New York, right?
Yeah.
And yet, these developers built a whole host of affordable homes by choice. Why did they do it? Because they were incentivized to do it.
Yeah.
Because with this tax credit model, they reduced their equity exposure, and it actually, the affordable part, unlocked the rest of the project because it acted as a capital injection.
So the affordable housing provision through the tax cut that was provided actually enabled the
project to
development.
go ahead. So that is I think that's an interesting sort of flip the equation on its head sort of thing.
Income tax credits are something that I'm not entirely...
In short...
Yes.
I'm
Nutshell it for me, bro.
I'm not an expert in this, but from what I understand of the model when I was there and, reading about it since, it's a system which incentivizes the building of affordable homes. The way it does that is by selling these tax credits. So as long as a developer maintains the affordable status of the homes, they get these tax credits. Now, these tax credits can be sold to big corporations like banks or whomever it is at 95 cents to the dollar. So that is a tax credit. I can offset my future tax liability. So they trade them, and for that is cash that they can use for the development. And it unlocks the development because they're not paying interest on that cash. All they need to do is maintain the affordable status and, the surrounding areas, the green spaces, the placemaking for either 15 or 30-year period, depending on which scheme they go for. They can offset the corporation tax. They buy a discount on the corporation tax.
Right.
So it's, let's call it central government, federal government in the US that is creating this credit. So at the end of the day, it's the central government or federal government that's paying for it.
I mean, we could transfer that same example to the UK if we create some type of market for realizing the value of those assets, because the affordable units, they do have value, right? And there are lenders and banks and other institutional investors, I'm sure, who have a different cash flow situation, who have much longer horizons, who are prepared to front the money for those, I imagine, and then realize the returns over a longer period of time.
Yeah, look, the bodies and the players exist. The Treasury could issue those credits, Homes England or the GLA could allocate them, corporations would buy them, and housing associations or for-profit RPs and SME developers could deliver them. The players are there, but the playbook isn't.
So isn't it still paying for that housing with money that otherwise would be the state's to spend elsewhere?
I agree, but you can't have subsidized housing without subsidy.
I'm not concerned about that principle, but just wanted to be clear, that we are still talking about public money going into affordable housing delivery, and really, really okay with that.
Well, I think, as we've said, I keep on coming around to the same conclusion, right? Yeah. If you let the market just do what the market does, and the market, I believe, is more inefficient here in the UK, you get levels of affordability that we currently have. Cash flow matters in development. It makes a meaningful difference to whether a project can go ahead or can't go ahead, and whether you get said grant, at the end of the project is different to whether you get it at the beginning in the US, where it can unlock a site, whether you get it at golden brick, which is, slightly earlier than the end, or a lot earlier than the end sometimes, or whether you get it to unlock the project and then you can go to secure your senior and mezz financing. These things, it feels like it's a detail. It unlocks a system. And I think if you look at sort of global comparisons, that LIHTC model is probably one of the most successful and long-lasting market intervention that government can make.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with you that public subsidy is the key ingredient there. That definitely speaks to a solution to the supply side. On the demand side of things, what can we do there? Because people have said in previous episodes of our podcast, build for sale is kind of dead in the water right now. And that's affecting housing delivery as well, right?
So Help to Buy is probably the most famous and recent demand side intervention, which helps first-time buyers get on the ladder. The issue that I have with a lot of demand-side interventions is that if they're done too crudely or left as a policy for too long, the main outcome it will have is asset inflation. So just increase prices. If I give everybody in the UK, all first-time buyers, an extra £50,000 and you have to spend it on housing, my guess is that the asking price of all new homes will just go up by £50,000. So what you generally tend to find, unless it's really short and targeted and time limited, you generally tend to find that a lot of demand-side interventions will simply just inflate asset prices without necessarily solving the problem.
Yeah.
But I guess there are other ways of incentivizing, and they don't necessarily all need to be for sale. And sub-institutional build-to-rent, PRS, is a very promising model, which I think we as a country need to be leaning on more, not less. But at least my generation has grown up on the promise that if we do everything right,
speak on it, yeah,
we work hard and we do well in school, we will be able to afford our homes. The unwritten contract, perhaps, that our generation will and can and should do better than the previous generation, and my daughter's generation will do better than our generation. And I think that social contract is what's at stake here.
Alex Uregian at City Sanctuary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host, Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.